So good morning, everyone. I cannot believe this is our last class. I mean, it feels like no time has passed at all. And yet, the week we began this class, it was 99 degrees in Nashville. And now I have to spend 10 minutes, scraping the frost off my car like I live in Buffalo. So Dr. Williams can't be here today. He may be able to stop in at the end, but it's the launch of an excellent new set of self-guided walking tours that he's been helping to create called Nashville Sites, S-I-T-E-S, Nashville Sites. And Lee wanted me to convey his gratitude to you all in his words, for making Thursday mornings this fall some of the most enjoyable days of the semester. And speaking for myself, I second that emotion. I'm so grateful to all of the volunteers and to everyone at Osher and the Temple for making this happen. Week in, week out, I've just been amazed at the quality of the AV work. Normally I'm basically a 19th century historian, and I like to keep things 19th century. No mics, no slides, and generally that works out because I go to so many talks where it's PowerPoint reliant and then something goes on the blink, and that's always a shame. But this has been perfect and seamless, and it's also been a challenge because I feel like I need to actually get good images for you all. Now, today we're going to be talking about the civil rights movement in Nashville, and I just have to say at the outset, that's a lot of ground to cover. The physics of it are daunting. The excellent account of the Nashville student movement, The Children, is an enormously heavy book, right? It's a big book. It's very hard to reduce that to an hour. And it's almost like one of those superhero movies that Martin Scorsese is so upset about, where there are 30 major characters and only 120 minutes, so each character really can only get 4 minutes to shine. And I know that in this talk, there are going to be omissions, there are going to be things that I'm going to gloss over, and I'm going to, my choice here is to focus on what I think are a few central moments that illustrate ideas that will help us frame and think about everything else. And I will also say, talking about the Nashville Civil Rights Movement, it's an especially tough project for a teacher here because so much of this history is within living memory. Many of you have undoubtedly experienced the city's transition from Jim Crow to something beyond Jim Crow, to civil rights. And I'm looking forward to our conversation at the end of the hour. For now, I want to start with a classic beginning of the civil rights struggle. We've heard this before. It starts in a world where every day men and women had to ride public transportation to work, and every day the social, political, and economic hierarchy of Jim Crow was reinforced by who got to sit in front, right, and who got to sit in the back. Anyone who tried to cross the line, who tried to sit where they were not supposed to sit, right? Anyone who even questioned why the rules were the way they were, they might face abuse from the driver, they might face physical threat or injury from other passengers, right? And they might face arrest or fine or imprisonment, right? And again, we know what happens in this story, right? An African-American woman refuses to give up her seat. She gets arrested. She gets put on trial. And a community organizes a boycott of public transportation, right? It takes elaborate planning, right, to find new ways for tens of thousands of African Americans to get to work, right? And it involves keeping up this enormous undertaking, this enormous protest for months, right? So what am I describing? Right? It could be the Montgomery bus boycott, right? 1955 to 1956. Actually, no. I'm describing the Nashville streetcar boycott of 1905. Right? We think of the civil rights era as the 1950s and the 1960s, right? And during those decades, Nashville was a centrally important place where key ideas, key tactics were forged, right? It's a place where activists and movement leaders were made. But the roots of civil rights in Nashville run deep, right? Nashville's movement, in many ways, illustrates what the historian Jacqueline Dowd Hall would call a long civil rights movement. And before we talk about the years that many of us lived through, I want to spend some time beyond our collective memory. So I hope you'll bear with me. And what I worry, I think, is going to be inevitable is, we're going to get to the 1960s and we're not going to have enough time, but I'm hoping we can just continue the conversation in the Q&A. So the roots of civil rights activism in Nashville run so deep, in large part because of all the things we've been talking about over the last 6 weeks. Right? Nashville, from its beginnings, it's a port on a river, right, with access to information streams from Canada to the Caribbean. People who were held as slaves, people who were living as free, people experiencing everything in between. They found ways. They used the opportunities and the independence that a city might sometimes offer to think about law and government and morality and politics and their rightful place in the world. There were strong churches, right, from before the Civil War onward, and ministers who fostered community. Many African Americans in Nashville before the Civil War, right, will remember they had gone to school and were literate. And after the Civil War, there were all kinds of new opportunities for higher education, right? Not just for Black Nashvillians, but also for African Americans from all over the South and really all over the country, right? Nashville's a magnet for people who are engaged with ideas, right? Thinking about how things are and how they could be. Additionally, right, because Nashville wasn't destroyed in the Civil War, it was a great place to start businesses, right? And it was a magnet for African Americans who wanted to make money, right? So there was capital and entrepreneurship and confidence in the Black community. Again and again, from slavery to emancipation to Jim Crow, finally to the Civil Rights era and beyond, we see these various factors coming together in the service of all kinds of causes. And by the time the 1950s come around, I would say that there is an infrastructure, physical and cultural, for supporting the next generation of activism and activists. There are many people who do not find the presence of student activists jarring or disturbing. Many, in fact, had been activists themselves as students and continued in their adulthood as activists. They're used to the activism, they expect it, they welcome it, So going back 50 years from the Montgomery bus boycott to 1905, when we see so when the state of Tennessee, when the legislature segregated streetcars in that year, the Nashville Negro Business League, right, which included James Carroll Napier on the left and Reverend Richard Henry Boyd. James Carroll Napier we've talked about in previous classes. Among other things, founder of one of the founders of the 1 cent savings bank. We had a question about whether he had gone to Wilberforce. He had gone to Wilberforce. He had gone to Oberlin. Went to Howard for law school. Came back here. Then Richard Henry Boyd, the National Baptist Publishing Board, right? Head of the National Baptist Publishing Board, is a man who came here from Texas in 1896. He was someone who had been born a slave, right? Essentially emancipated at Juneteenth, emancipated at the end of the war, but you see Nashville as a magnet for ambitious entrepreneurial people, whether in or out of the church, right? He came here for a reason. The Nashville Negro Business League denounced the statute, right, the segregation statute, as an abomination, right? They raised money to lobby the legislature to change the bill. They financed legal challenges, right? And ultimately, they created the Union Transportation Company, right, with their own fleet to bus people around, right? And some really complicated logistics, right? They had to map different routes around the city. Now, if you'll forgive me a quick aside, 1905, right? It sounds kind of early for this sort of movement. But I focus on the 19th century, and to me, it sounds strangely late. So we think Plessy versus Ferguson, right? The U.S. Supreme Court case that affirmed the rule of separate but equal in transportation, right? It's a case that upheld a Louisiana statute mandating separate but equal in train transportation. That was a case decided in 1896, right? So that's 9 years before the 1905 boycott. Tennessee's trains actually had been segregated long before then, certainly in the 1870s. So the civil rights cases of 1883, which infamously ruled that the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was unconstitutional, right? That was which included a public accommodations provision. That involved a Tennessee train case, among other cases. So Tennessee was on the vanguard of segregating trains. Tennessee was also, pioneered attempts to disenfranchise African Americans. We think about Tennessee as kind of an early actor in dismantling and reacting to Reconstruction. And why was that? I mean, I think in part it's because the state politically was actually rather evenly divided, right? So you have the Republican, traditionally anti-slavery East, right? Then you have the slave strongholds of the West, right? Dividing Republican and Democrat. And African Americans formed a potentially decisive swing bloc, right? And among legal scholars, Kenneth Mack has written about how that presented the Democratic Party with a series of choices to make, whether to compete for African American votes or whether to eliminate black votes and really go all in on segregation. And we know the path they took, right? And one of the first things that the Democratic legislature did was segregating the trains, right? And early on, black Tennesseans fought these efforts very hard. Among them was a young Ida B. Wells in Memphis, right? So when she was a teacher, before she became a journalist, right? Years before her friends were murdered in the lynching at the Curve, right? Years before she was forced into exile, right? And into a life of anti-lynching activism. Before all of that, she was a teacher, right? Going to and from work, and she refused to leave a first-class car. And then she challenged the segregation policy all the way to the Tennessee Supreme Court. Often, trains were segregated, before Plessy versus Ferguson, trains were often segregated by a first-class car that was called the women's car. It's really only for women. And then there was the smoker. And so Kenneth Mack writes about this. Barbara Welke is another historian who's written about this very well. And what that means is racial segregation got mapped onto this gender segregation. And as a result, a lot of the plaintiffs in these challenges to train segregation in Tennessee and all over the South were women, right? Women who could afford a first-class ticket, right, but were denied the right to sit there. But still, we have Tennessee ruling that legislating that trains had to be segregated, but they didn't get around to segregating streetcars until 1905. And why was that? In fact, when Plessy was decided in 1896, there was this majority opinion, separate but equal, and then there was a dissent. That's one of the most famous dissents in legal history, right, by the Justice John Marshall Harlan, Kentuckian. And among other things, he tried to describe the absurd consequences of the separate but equal rule. And one absurdity was, well, maybe cities and states could force people to, African Americans to walk on one side of the street and whites to walk on the other side. They could segregate sidewalks. Absurd, right? And then the other absurd consequence that Harlan viewed as flowing from the court's decision was the segregation of streetcars. It was regarded as absurd to regulate streetcars in that way. If we think about it, people hopped on, people hopped off all the time. The cars were small. The racial composition of a car could just fluctuate rapidly from stop to stop, right? And it seemed to make no sense to draw a rigid line, right, in a streetcar, and then spend the time and all the manpower policing that. But here's the reason I mention this. Once a society starts segregating, right, every space that's not segregated gives the lie to the rationales of Jim Crow, right? The state has put so much energy into putting African Americans in one place, whites in another place, and it has this elaborate set of justifications for it. But when you can just get on a streetcar, right, and the world doesn't end, right, then it seems like the purpose underlying Jim Crow is revealed for the sham that it is. And as a result, what we see with Jim Crow is that it has a cascading logic, right? Once you start segregating one place, you have to start segregating the next place and the next place and the next place. And African Americans in Nashville found themselves caught in this brutal logic, right? But they were determined to fight it. And so they did that wherever they could. Now, I should also say, the constant lawmaking that burdened and disabled and humiliated African Americans was always accompanied by violence in the Jim Crow era, right? We've talked about this at different times before. Last week, Dr. Williams spoke in the Q&A about lynchings in Nashville, and he's been very active in working with We Remember Nashville, getting memorials put up in conjunction with the Equal Justice Initiative's memorializing project. And I want to just mention a couple of cases and mention them because they became moments for organizing and action and political consciousness raising within the African American community. Again, laying down roots for a long civil rights movement. So first, 1924. See what I have now. 1924, a 15-year-old named Sammy Smith was pulled out of his hospital bed in the middle of the night in Nashville General Hospital. And he was lynched on Nolensville Pike. In response to that, the NAACP sent an investigator named Walter Wright to issue a report, make some factual findings, write up a report. Now, Walter Wright was someone who had investigated lynchings all over the South. And if we think about lynchings during the Jim Crow era, if you look at basically a 50-year period, 1880 to 1930, what you'll find is, the incidents of lynchings in the South range from once a week to once every couple days, right? And what that means, whether it's in one's local community, whether it's reported in the papers and you're just reading about it constantly, this is hard to escape, right? And coming to Nashville for Wright, it was part of work that he had been doing. He was someone who, phenotypically, people mistook him for a white person, right? So he would go to various towns, investigate lynchings, and have these candid conversations with essentially members of the lynch mobs, right? And then he would report back to the NAACP. Oftentimes he would, get on the train kind of a step ahead of people who would do harm to him. So coming to Nashville, it was an opportunity to get the facts, right? It was an opportunity to do justice, right? Or try to do justice. But it was also an opportunity to cement the relationship between Nashville's black community and the NAACP, that's National Civil Rights Organization, right? And one thing that's very interesting, the Library of Congress on its website actually has several pages from White's reports on the lynching of Sammy Smith. And what you see in those reports is that Smith's lynching, while widely denounced by sort of white civic leaders, but also denounced very formally by various African American groups, it was a rare occurrence as a lynching, but it was hardly unique. So African Americans in Nashville, he found, were living under constant threat of violence. And so he reported on the facts of this lynching, but he also reported case after case after case of people who were threatened with death, right, by people on streetcars, unarmed men who were murdered by the police, right, and people who were, he reported on a Pullman porter who was killed on a train. I think the head of the Jack Daniels distillery, right? And all of this was done with complete impunity, right? And what he said was the lynching of Sammy Smith was not surprising, right? And for many white people in Nashville, it was, perfectly acceptable, right? Even deserved and desirable. Other instances of just the violence, the everyday violence of Jim Crow. The Roger Williams University, Dr. Williams mentioned last week, is a school that is on what's now the Peabody campus at Vanderbilt. There were beautiful buildings that he showed, and they burned to the ground, right? And those were widely assumed to be arson. Walter Wright, in his investigation, reported that the Ku Klux Klan wasn't just operating openly in Nashville in mid-1920s. They had bought a house in what's now Music Row, within walking distance from Vanderbilt and Belmont. Right? And so Nashville may have had comparatively few lynchings, right? Just a small handful of documented lynchings. But the threat of it, right, and the justification for it, and the assumed impunity of it, that was very, very, very strong. But for these lynchings, they were, it was terrorism inflicted on the African American community, but it also was also responded to, right, with organization and activism.
What was the ostensible reason for lynching Sammy Smith?
Yeah, so Sammy Smith, there had been a shootout on Nolensville Pike. Smith and I believe it was his uncle had a flat tire and were on someone's land who confronted them with a gun. And I think Smith's uncle had a gun, and Smith's uncle was killed, and the man who confronted them was killed. Smith, I think, was mortally wounded. Right, was basically dying in the hospital, but then he was lynched anyway. And let me just mention another lynching 10 years later, not 9 years later. So lynching of a young man named Courtney Cheek, who in Columbia, in Murray County, he was accused of an assault. He was sent to Nashville for his security. The grand jury in Davidson County actually absolved him of, refused to indict. He was freed into the custody of his uncle and aunt, who lived on Jackson Street, right across from the campus of Fisk University. And in 1933, a caravan of cars from Murray County pulled up outside the house, and an armed mob in broad daylight kidnapped Courtney Cheek, drove through the Fisk campus, right, brandishing weapons, and then went back to Columbia and killed him. Now, students at Fisk, it was broad daylight, students at Fisk were watching this. Students at Fisk took down license plate numbers, included the car of the sheriff of Murray County. And among those students was the student body president, John Hope Franklin, who became a great historian. And it was a moment of intense campus activism, intense reflection and resolve among the students. And it was something that many of the students carried with them all their lives. John Hope Franklin talked about this again and again and again throughout his life. Now, the universities were particular locations for activism in Black Nashville. So, for example, Fisk had over years throughout the early 20th century and onward, right, you see numerous student protests. And in the late 19th century, you also see student protests at Roger Williams, too. Unlike the antebellum schools, right, these universities had white administrations. They were often very strict and rule-bound and out of touch with student interests. And the students the universities attracted, right, were capable of having bold visions for themselves and for society. Just glad it's not my phone. And they, Fisk was a place where many people learned how to protest, learned how to organize, right? And it was an education for lots of people, right? For W.E.B. Du Bois going to Fisk as an undergraduate in the late 19th century, he had come from Great Barrington, Massachusetts, where he was the only African American in his school. Right, coming to Fisk for him was this incredible moment where, the way he describes it, it's almost like he learned how to be African American, what being African American meant, right? And so it was a place of incredible growth and self-expression. And then we should also say that Fisk University attracted faculty, right, with very strong political consciousness too. All right, I'm going to mention one of them, and I'm just going to, let's see. I think I have, sorry, there's, oh no, actually rats. All right, I'll mention one of them. One member of the faculty. There's all kinds of good stuff. It's coming, it's coming. So in 1926, Z. Alexander Luby, Zephaniah Alexander Luby, came to Nashville. He had been born in Antigua in the Caribbean, and then he had gone to school at Howard, went to law school at Columbia. He got a JSD, a higher law degree at NYU. So how did he end up in Nashville? He got a teaching job at Fisk. Right? If we think about the people Fisk attracted, right? They were from all over. If we think about the 1920s, it was a very exciting time to be in New York. But after the stock market crashed, as the Harlem Renaissance kind of petered out, right? A lot of people wound up at Fisk, right? It was where Harlem went, right? After the Harlem Renaissance was over. But Luby got a teaching job at Fisk, and then 2 years later, he took and passed the Tennessee bar. Now, one thing to say is, if we think about Nashville's higher education, right, it brings Luby here. And then also, if we think about other infrastructure in Nashville, right, the fact that there is a big business community, right? The fact that there is wealth in the African American community in Nashville. It means that, unlike other places, Nashville could support black lawyers, right? And Luby wound up becoming a key local counsel, right, to the national NAACP. He worked closely with Thurgood Marshall, so 15 years after Courtney Cheek's lynching, in Columbia, in Murray County, where memories of that lynching had never gone away. There was what was known as the Columbia Race Riots. Luby worked closely with Thurgood Marshall in those cases. There were multiple people who were arrested and put on trial. And after those trials were resolved, that was the moment when, late 1940s, through all of his travels all over the South, Thurgood Marshall singles out Maury County as the place where he came closest to being lynched. Right? And trials were over, and there were multiple cars that were in a caravan trying to just get to Nashville. And Marshall was actually stopped by a police officer who was looking for him, brought into town. Police officer first asked him to walk ahead of him. Marshall refused to do that because he thought he'd be accused of escaping and shot in the back. He said that Columbia was basically empty because everyone was at the river waiting for him. And the officer had said he was stopping them for driving under the influence. And Marshall insisted on being taken to a justice of the peace. There happened to be a justice of the peace who was in the town. Said he was a teetotaler, smelled Thurgood Marshall's breath, said he was sober, and then Luby raced with him to Nashville at that point. On the phone to the National NAACP, I believe it was Roy Wilkins, asked Marshall, well, were you drunk? And Marshall said, no, but I'm about to be. But Luby, at Marshall's side, right, working very closely with the National NAACP. And when Brown versus Board of Education was decided in 1954, Luby very soon afterwards filed Kelly versus Nashville School Board. And what he encountered was a determined and sophisticated opposition. It actually, the opposition, they had experience in resisting Supreme Court decisions. So in the late 1940s, when the Supreme Court decided the Sepwell and McLaurin cases that mandated integrated graduate education, picking up on a 1938 case. Cecil Sims, one of the major lawyers in Nashville, tried to establish Meharry as a public medical and dental school that would be used by all of the segregated southern states as their medical and dental school. So there was a way of trying to evade integrating graduate facilities. Instead of, you apply to medical school at the University of North Carolina, the hope was that they would then send you to Meharry, right? And the Meharry administration actually seemed to want to play ball with Sims, who was a board member. The faculty did not, again, it was a moment of activism, right? The faculty was revolted by that possibility and protested that strenuously. So with Luby's challenge, right, to segregated public education, elementary through high school education, what they found in terms of resistance were lawyers who said, we're not going to take to the streets and torch buildings. We're not going, although there were bombings, right? We're not going to shut down all the public schools. What Sims and others described, and Sims gave speeches about this all over the South, was that Brown versus Board of Education simply required the schools to stop explicitly labeling students, right? But that it didn't have to change the world in any way. And one of the proposals that the Nashville School Board tried to tried to make in response to Luby's lawsuit was what became known as the Nashville Plan, right? And the plan was to integrate 1 grade a year, right, starting at kindergarten, and ending in 1968, right? And then it would also be accompanied by very liberal transfer opt-out policies. And I think we can, flash forward a few years, and as 1959 becomes 1960, right, there is a cohort of students, right, who come to Nashville who were just hitting their teenage years when Brown was decided, right? And when Brown was decided, people like people like John Lewis, right? People like James Bevel, right? People like Marion Barry, who's in the trench coat. They were teenagers or almost teens, right, when Brown was decided, and they had the expectation, right, that the Supreme Court had decided a case, and so society would change, right? They thought, well, now we're going to go to desegregated schools. But by the time they got to Fisk, by the time they got to Meharry, by the time they got to American Baptist, right, they had gone through schools that had remained segregated, right? More than anyone else, the students who were coming to Nashville at that moment had a sense of the limitations of what people like Alexander Luby were trying to do in the courts. And there was a strong sense that legal challenges had failed them, right? That there were ways that the world could work their way around whatever even the Supreme Court decided. And among those students I'm sorry, this is so out of order, were James Lawson, right, who was at the Vanderbilt Divinity School, had been a Fulbright in India, a student of Gandhian nonviolent social change, right? And so the students began to engage in an extended conversation among themselves, right, about what could be done, right, if the courts couldn't get the job done, right, if the lawyers couldn't get the job done. And, there was infrastructure, right, for the students to have those conversations, right? Among other places, there was the Highlander Folk School in Monteagle, down in Monteagle, right, which had been formed by Miles Horton as kind of a union organizing adult education center for the mountains. But then when the AFL-CIO, really the CIO, sort of tried to monopolize all the union outreach, he kind of shifted into civil rights mode. So that's where Rosa Parks went to several workshops, right, talking about civil disobedience, right? It's where Martin Luther King met with James Lawson, right, and heard James Lawson speak about Gandhian nonviolence, right? So Highlander Folk School was an important site, and it was there. State of Tennessee, towards the late 50s, early 60s, shut it down on the ground that they were selling liquor without a license. Highlander Folk School was represented by Cecil Brandstetter and George Barrett. George Barrett, who had gone to Highlander, spent summers there as a college student, His remark was, he said to me, they weren't selling liquor without a license, but we sure did a lot of drinking up there. And so there's Highlander, but then beyond Highlander, right? We've talked about the importance of black churches to Nashville's African American community, and the First Baptist Capitol Hill wound up becoming a key place where Reverend Lawson was. Here's Kelly Miller Smith, where Reverend Lawson could lead a group of students who were trying to figure out what they could do, right? How nonviolent resistance could work, right? And what they were talking about was sitting in, right? And this was something that people actually had experience with. So the Reverend C.T. Vivian, who is part of this group, right, who was at American Baptist, who had met Lawson in 1959. Vivian had experience doing sit-ins, dating back years, right? And there was lots of conversation about the theory of what they were trying to do, right, and how they could move society in the absence of courts and political process, right, and they in the fall of 1959 there were test runs that they were doing. Right, they were trying to rehearse this and choreograph it and routinize it, and then on February 1st in Greensboro, North Carolina, a small group of students, sort of more or less spontaneously, decided to sit in at a lunch counter, and to the extent anything could go viral in 1960, right? It did, right? People started sitting in all over the South, right? And Lawson and the group of students he was working with, right? Who included Diane Nash, who had come from Chicago to Fisk, included John Lewis, who had come to American Baptist, right? Who included, there's C.T. Vivian next to Diane Nash, who included James Bevel. They decided to rush their calendar forward, right? And February 13th, they began their protests. And now, all through the course of February, right, there were sit-ins in Nashville, right? And I guess you can go to Woolworth's on 5th and have a fancy lunch and see the lunch counter there. And what's very interesting, I guess, what I will say is. The students had a very strong idea about what the law could and couldn't do, right? And they were determined to work outside of legal processes. And oftentimes, the way historians talk about direct action, this direct action phase of the civil rights movement, it's in opposition to the NAACP's litigation strategy, right? And people quote Roy Wilkins at the NAACP saying, "I can't believe these kids are sitting in," or they'll sort of take quotes, I think, out of context from Thurgood Marshall, right? Also sort of poo-pooing direct action. But what you find is, after sitting in several times, right, at various lunch counters and department stores, after enduring violence of white supremacists and just kind of hooligans who were there to harass them, right? After enduring discrimination from the police, right? Many of the students were arrested, right? And they were arrested en masse. They were charged with disorderly conduct. And they were charged in ways actually that were very threatening to them. Potentially it could mean serious jail time, felonies for people who were in college, right? They actually had a fair amount to lose, right? And the state was really bearing down on them. And what you see at this moment actually is that the relationship between the lawyers and the protesters it does not fall into this neat opposition. So Alexander Luby and the entire black bar in Nashville all represent the protesters. So I guess you see Luby in the bow tie. Well, is that Luby in the bow tie? Oh, to the left, gray hair. Yes, I was thinking his hair's too dark. So you see Luby to the left, far left, and so the lawyers are deeply engaged in the enterprise of representing the students. The Baptist ministers, right, very quickly issue statements that are enormously supportive. Nashville's African American community raises a tremendous amount of money, right, to support the student protesters. Dr. Williams talks about the bookies on Jefferson Street providing needed capital for bail funds. And in court, in many ways, the court changes the dynamic. So students who had been very oppositional and very down on what law could do for them discovered that being in court gave them a platform that was very rare. So when they were being tried, thousands of people were lined around the courthouse, right? And in court, there were reporters who were reporting their words, right? So you see people like Diane Nash, right, standing up and addressing the court, right, in ways that are, maybe, I hate to say it, but they're pretty lawyerly and, very cogent as legal arguments for freedom and equality. And also very canny about what legal process can and can't do to them. So when they are fined $50 each, Nash says in court, "We feel that if we pay these fines, we'd be contributing to and supporting the injustice and immoral practices that have been performed in the arrest and conviction of the defendants." So they decide they would rather take jail terms, right? Which has the effect of burdening the system in a way that is very disruptive. And at the same time that students are making legal comments, right? Making legal arguments in court, their lawyers actually are railing against the racism of the charges. And if you look at these court proceedings, you can read about them in various newspapers. What you see is this interesting kind of role reversal, right? It's almost like the lawyers are the protesters and the protesters are the lawyers. And on April 19th, 1960, in the middle of the night, Alexander Luby and his wife were asleep in their house. The Lubys were in the early 60s, right? And a very powerful bomb blew up outside their house. They were safe, but their house was destroyed. You can see the rebuilt house today, and it's built in a way, the windows are very unusual. It's built in a way so that it could withstand another blast, right? And dozens of windows at Meharry were broken, right, from the force of the blast. And so again, he's a lawyer. He was also a city councilman by that point, and he is directly attacked, right? He isn't just fighting the civil rights struggle in the courtroom. And the next day, there is a march, right, that moves from Tennessee State to the public square, right? And on the courthouse steps, on the courthouse steps at the public square, Reverend Vivian gave a statement, right? And then the mayor, Ben West, was there meeting the protesters. And at that moment, Diane Nash starts questioning the mayor directly, right? And after spending all these weeks dealing with courthouses, she is an impressive cross-examiner, right? She asked the mayor if he felt it was, what he thought. Was it wrong to discriminate against someone based on their race? And the mayor agreed it was wrong, right? And then Diane Nash followed up, asking him if he believed that the lunch counter should be desegregated, right? And the mayor answered yes, right? She cross-examined him, he cracked, right? And this was a turning point, right, in desegregating the lunch counters. Now, our time is short. I just want to make a few more comments, and then we can go to question and answer. What I will say is, we talked about a long civil rights movement, right? Something that stretched back, from the 50s, from the 60s for decades, right? But it also stretches forward, and there are many ways. This was a key moment, right? But it didn't really mark an end to anything, right? So Luby's school cases, right, they stretch on to the late 90s, right? They go on basically for 40 plus years. And they go from Luby to the next generation, to his partner Avon Williams, right, to the next generation, Avon Williams' partner Richard Dinkins, right, Judge Dinkins, right? And for 40 years, remedy after remedy, after remedy after remedy, and then in the 1990s, at a point where actually the schools had found some success desegregating, right, and some success in closing various gaps, right, in the black and white educational experience in Nashville. Nashville's declared unitary, right, that it wasn't segregated anymore. Court supervision ended, and what's happened in Nashville? Right, we've resegregated, right? In the late 1960s, Rita Sanders Geyer, right, represented by George Barrett, they together sue the University of Tennessee system, right, because the University of Tennessee was going to expand greatly in Nashville while Tennessee State University was systematically underfunded. Right? And again, a challenge to segregation in higher education in Tennessee that is very meaningful, but stretches for decades and decades and decades, right? These struggles in the courts are certainly long, and outside of the court, incredibly long struggles. We also see the gutting of Jefferson Street, right, where the traditional black business core is emptied out, right, because the I-40 is routed through Jefferson Street. And initially, the I-40 had been routed along Charlotte, right, and at some point, it was moved to strike right through the heart of Black Nashville, right, North Nashville. And there were multiple meetings about it, but notice of the meetings might get posted in one post office in a white zip code, right? Or a notice would give the wrong date or the wrong time or the wrong place. It was almost entirely unnoticed, right? And then finally, there's a massive legal effort to try and stop the I-40. And I think to the shame of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, you see a decision that acknowledges the grave deficiencies in the service of process, right, in grave deficiencies of notice. You know, it acknowledges the deception, right, that went into this horrible piece of public policy. And then the courts say, well, interstates are important. A lot of the property has already been bought up, so we're just going to let it go ahead, right? And we're still living with that, right? Decades, 50 years later, 50 plus years later, right? And again, you know, I think we see that you know, what gets hashed out, right, during kind of the classic years of the civil rights era are things that stretch on and on and on, right? We live with their legacies. And you know, today, this is kind of how I began on our first week together, right? As the whole city gentrifies at the same time, right? As it seems like the whole city is being paved over, right, at once. As so much of the city's history, you know, either appears invisible or is rapidly becoming invisible, right, to all of us. I think, you know, it's a moment when we have to think about, you know, what we owe each other, right, as Nashvillians, what we should prioritize as policy, right? And I think my hope is that, you know, this history, right, our history, can guide us, right, and help us understand who matters, who belongs, right, what has made our city the city that it is, right, and what it should continue to represent. All right, I'm going to stop here so we have at least some time to talk. Yes. Oh, sure. You know, the Nashville Public Library is. Oh yeah, there's. Could I mention the civil rights programming at the Nashville Public Library? The main library has a civil rights room. It's an incredible repository of oral histories. There are also just wonderful newspaper clipping files. The Davidson County Archives are actually also now in the main branch. They're no longer by the movie theater at the Green Hills Mall. Which always, I don't know, it's like the one time I enjoyed going to the mall. And so Nashville Civil Rights Room is an incredible resource, and they have all kinds of programming too. Other questions?
I would just like to say that tying it up to this wonderful series today, you explains to me what I always knew was something out of place in my short 21-year history here in Nashville, having moved from the New York City area. I felt with Jim Crow when I came here. I have to admit, 21 years ago, and now I see why and I understand why. Thank you very much. It's very moving.
Well, thank you. Yes. With suffrage is. Yeah, so there's a question about Frankie Pierce and the protests of the lack of bathroom facilities for African Americans. You know, this is something that you see, in lots of different cities across the South, right? This is from the late 19th century onward, people are complaining about and are experiencing the deprivations of a built environment that's segregated, right? And if we look at old buildings, right, in downtown Nashville, right, you can still see the architecture of Jim Crow. You can see, you can look for side entrances and back entrances, and there are, in many ways, the landscape is continues to be marked by this, right? It doesn't go away, and and so there are all kinds of ways that over years that people have tried to talk about the basic inhumanities, daily inhumanities of Jim Crow, right? And ways people have tried to use that to to change things and make things better in some short-term way, right? And then there are all kinds of other ways that people have written about these daily indignities to point out the larger inhumanities of Jim Crow. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't think it's particularly special. I think you can find all kinds of other hotbeds of hatred, in Middle Tennessee and other parts of the state too. Yeah.
Close proximity
To Pulaski, right? No, certainly Murray County has this long history as the cradle of the Klan, but again, I would say I don't know. It's hard to say that any one place is more racist than other places. Yeah.
Was there another southern city since the 60s that did a better job than Nashville, the model we could have followed? Or did Nashville create a model for others? Where does Nashville fit in the broader effort?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And what I should have mentioned is the sit-in protesters of 1960 wind up forming the leadership of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, right, going all over the South. And essentially, the identities as activists that people forge in Nashville, wind up becoming a model for civil rights activism all over the country, right? In terms of the question was, are there other cities that did it better? I mean, in some ways, I feel like Nashville tried to be. There were different models. One model was like Nashville and like Atlanta to a certain degree, right? Where Atlanta billed itself as was it the city too busy to hate? Is that what it was? and they would compare themselves to Birmingham, right, which was just a raging disaster. And but I would say, again, it's we think about Nashville, and a lot of Nashville is their policy. A lot of it is geared to it's like there's an old Italian movie called The Leopard. It's incredibly long. It's Burt Lancaster. He's dubbed into Italian. But it's about the transformation of the unification of Italy, the transformation of the giving way of the hereditary nobility to the rising middle class. And the Leopard is this duke who says, in order for everything has to change in order for everything to stay the same, right? And in many ways, right, Nashville public policy is about transformation without meaningful change, right? Things stay the same even as they're changing, and it's a place where there is less violence, right? There's one period of rioting, but really it's much less violent than lots of other places around the South. But at the same time, a lot of the issues, you really just see how persistent they are, right? And and we see that in our housing policy and transportation policy. We see it in the public schools in many ways is still kind of living through this, right? And so I don't know, it's hard. Like I think that the places where what we've seen in terms of models, I don't know. I think if we're thinking about education, for example, the places where public education has worked, on a kind of a non-racial, broad-based way, right? Are school systems where there's been busing, right? Where there's just been forced integration, right? And that kind of forced integration has actually really been good for the project of education, right? At least, you can look at, really important journalism recently by Nicole Hannah Jones. It's, so there are, certain policies that have worked, but all across the South and really all over the country, we've seen just how persistent school segregation is, and that's mainly white people resisting going to school with African American children. We've seen the persistence of housing segregation, right? Just in massive ways, right? And post Shelley versus Kramer and the end of racially restrictive covenants, but then also post Fair Housing Act of 1968, right? People can still bring those fair housing claims, and realtors are doing the same things. The buying practices, the selling practices, are still largely the same. And so there's so many ways that that inequality is resilient, right? And so it's it's a challenge, but I think I don't know. I don't feel like there's one place that has really nailed it. Yeah.
I'm very good in Nashville, 3 years, and lived 9 times as long as this in Birmingham. And coming here and seeing the metro form of government, I take that to be a sign that Nashville managed its affairs much better, or am I wrong to draw a conclusion from that?
No, I mean, I think that metro government has been, it's been very important to the kind of long-term viability of Nashville and Davidson County, and just I remember visiting Jackson for a research trip where I came in after dark. I stayed at a hotel right across from the archive. I woke up, I went to the archive, and I thought the archive was great. And I thought, wow, Jackson must be a great town. And then I went out, and it seemed like the entire downtown, the entire old African-American commercial district, everything was boarded up, right? It was like the entire city had been hollowed out. And instead, so much development was all about the ring suburbs, right? And, this is what happens when you don't have unified state county government, right? It's so easy to externalize and flight becomes so prevalent. So Nashville, hedged on that a little bit, right, by unifying with the county. I mean, I will say, like, if we look at the original motives of, Cecil Sims was the architect of city-county unification, and I think a big part of his motive for it, if we look at the motives, he's living right around here in a house called Cecilwood, and his vision was he wanted to keep Belmead money, right, having a stake in the political affairs of downtown, right? And so, there are kind of mixed motives behind unifying city and county government. And I think as a general matter, it's, worked well in a lot of ways for the city. But, the city still has all kinds of, long-term, serious issues that it has to deal with. But at least there is a city here, and it's not just suburbs. Yep.
Well, I've got two observations to make on the whole subject.
Please.
One being the fact that Metro Nashville schools are sort of a mess, and that's no secret. And then on the other hand, the amazing number of private schools for high school are just blossoming in the early 70s.
Yeah. No, I mean, every time I drive to the temple, I drive by Ensworth, right? And the sign says, I think it's founded in 1958. And every time I drive by, I think, like, geez, like, maybe you shouldn't be so proud of that, right? And, you think about I mean, it's a part of this, the legacies of 1954 and beyond, right? This is long, decades-long issues that are, you see that, right? And, you look at, what's, you can look at the schools and you can see that there are, many issues that don't just get resolved, right? We still have, there are still, all kinds of issues that remain very salient for us as Nashvillians.
Make reference to this persistence of injustice and this continued forward, looking at the things that are problematic. I would dare say that we're not getting to the root of the problem. And I was wondering what you think in your looking at the history of this root of the problem. One of the things that seems to be clear that there is, we use the term terrorism. Some people even call it genocide of people of color, Black people. What's the root of the problem that we get into 2019, 20? You see different faces, but the same problem of people having no rights, having to fight for rights, having no home, having no jobs. But what you're showing us is there is a history of government action
I mean, I almost think that is, better left as a rhetorical question, right? It is, I think that's the key question that's driving everyone, trying to work on these kinds of issues, right? I mean, to me, I sort of tend to go back to Reconstruction, right? Where I think that is this moment where there are debates about, the connection between race and citizenship, debates over the meaning of liberty and equality, and debates over, the proper size, scope, role, like basic orientation of government, right? Where people start talking about those issues in ways that appear just strikingly recognizable to me sitting here, in 2019, right? I think that so much is about the persistence of social and economic hierarchies, right? Even as legal ground rules change, right? And to keep things the same as the world is turning, right? As the world is changing, requires all kinds of different kinds of adjustments over years. And I think in some ways, race is such it's a concept without a fixed definition, right? So I feel like it's something that can constantly adjust to, you can just fill it with whatever content you need, right, at whatever moment. And it's just a tool that has been used again and again and again. But I will also say, right, that in many ways, the struggle gets more furious at moments when it seems like real progress is possible, right? So if we think about Tennessee during Reconstruction, right? It's this moment when there actually is this possibility of African Americans serving as this swing constituency, right? Having real political power, right? In the aftermath of civil rights, right? There are bombs going off, right? Because the prospect of liberty and equality is so close, right? And so I feel like even as we live through headline after headline after headline. My alarm clock rings and NPR is on, and I just feel whatever color is left in my hair just leaching out of it, right? And I think so much of this, it feels like the struggles are very much alive, right? But also they feel like they have a quality of there's a desperate quality to some of the political opposition, right? I feel like there is kind of a wounded bear quality, right? And I think what it means that these struggles are incredibly long, they're incredibly hard, but at least they have to be fought. All right, thank you, everybody.